I'd like to welcome Ken Baldwin here today to talk with us in the ACSM's Distinguished Leaders in Sports Medicine and Exercise Science series. So thanks for visiting a while, Ken.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. It's been fun. We've interviewed a few people already today, including your colleague, Frank Booth. And so I just wanted to start off a little bit with your early career. Where you grew up, where you went to school, to college, sort of the whole way through until you hit Iowa City. And then we'll take a lot more time for that maybe, but it's up to you. So,
Well, the journey for me began in Leominster, Massachusetts, a small plastic city about 40 miles west of Boston. I graduated from high school there. I was a three-sport athlete, and it was probably that early experience that got me interested in physical education, coaching, and I was fortunate to get accepted to Springfield College, where Naismith invented
just backing
basketball.
up, when were you in high school and what were the sports?
Well, I was in high school from 1956 to 60. I played three sports. I was a quarterback on the football team. I was a point guard on the basketball team, and I was the ace pitcher.
Wow.
So I had three sports, and I was pivotal in all of those individual sports.
And you were influenced by your physical education teacher at all, or just the sports thing? Because Springfield, as you were saying, is the home of basketball and noted for physical education and all that.
Well, it was through the sporting experience that got me interested in staying linked to it, and I thought physical education was a worthy area to move forward into that framework, and I was also a student of the game, and I wanted to become a basketball coach.
So that was the main one you wanted
That was
to coach.
the area I really got an interest in. And
before I interrupted you, you were saying that's where Naismith invented basketball.
that's correct. And in fact, when I was an undergraduate student there, I had to take three skill courses in gymnastics, and the gymnastics were taught in the arena that Naismith made, where they had the peach basket up in the
Did
loft
they really?
there. Yeah.
Was it named Naismith then?
Yeah, it
or
was
did
Naismith. Yeah.
Naismith Gym? Or
Yeah, exactly.
I'll be darned. Was Karpovich there when you went?
Karpovich was there, but the interesting framework for me was that Dr. Charles Tipton was there. And in my junior year, I had to take an elective, a required elective in exercise physiology. And that's where the detour began. I became fascinated with exercise science, exercise physiology. Tipton was a very dynamic instructor, and he turned me on. And as a result, I actually became his lab assistant.
What year was that, Ken?
That was in 1962.
Okay.
In 62 into 63,
Okay.
I was his lab instructor, and I also was his rat runner. He was working on a project there in terms of why exercise causes bradycardia, the slowing of the heart rate. And so I was training his rats on running wheels, and then at the end of that year, I thought I was going to continue working with him, and lo and behold, when I came back for my senior year, Dr. Tipton was in Iowa. He migrated to Iowa City. And so at that time, I didn't know basically, what the nature of the program was, and I applied to graduate school, and I ended up going to the University of Massachusetts, where I did a master's degree.
In Amherst?
In Amherst.
Who was there, Ben Ritchie?
Ben Ritchie. In fact, I did my master's thesis on oxygen debt under Dr. Ritchie.
That's where I did some work as a master's student, actually.
Is that right?
Started out there, yeah.
And the interesting thing that Dr. Ritchie kept telling me is that, you know, the exercise movement is going to be dependent upon biochemistry. And I never forgot that. And after I got my master's degree, I was interested in terms of high school or college or what have you. I didn't know. And there was a job opening that came up at Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire. And I went there for a year, knowing it was only for a year. And I filled in and taught exercise physiology, first aid, skill courses. I had the whole gamut in replacing one of the leading instructors there. And while I was at Keene, I was starting to think about the future, because that was turning me on. And then I wrote a letter to Dr. Tipton at Iowa, and he gave me the layout of what the program was. And in order to qualify for his program, I basically had to go back to school. I had to go back and get chemistry, organic chemistry, calculus.
Wow.
In order to just to pass the prerequisites to get into the program at Iowa. And so what happened was I went back to UMass and I taught several courses there, and then I could take all my prerequisites on the UMass campus. And so when I finished that, during that year I applied and received a NDAA fellowship that Dr. Tipton had, and
I think Frank had gotten the same thing.
Yes.
He told me.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What year was that then?
So I arrived in Iowa City in 1967,
Okay.
and but that was an eye-opener for me because of the rigid program that we had there with biochemistry, medical physiology, endocrinology. We basically had a similar curriculum as a first-year medical student would have, and they would go into the clinics and we went into the laboratory.
Okay.
And I was fortunate to have Jim Barnard as basically my mentor in the program, and I learned a lot from Jim, who was a very aggressive graduate student there. And
Where did Jim come from?
Jim came from Ohio.
Okay.
I think he started his, I think he went to Kent State.
All right. So he started the year before you. He was in a
he
year or two.
he was basically finishing up when
Oh,
I
he
was coming.
Okay. So
Yeah.
so he had gone there as soon as Tipton did. They probably arrived.
He was one of the first students in the
program.
exercise science program.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And so I was fortunate enough that I had a lot of the prerequisites, not only for getting into the program, but I had coursework done that I really cut a year out of my Ph.D. training and got into my dissertation, which dealt with the muscle fiber types in terms of their fatigue characteristics and the biochemical properties of them, and that was what the focal point was on my dissertation. And at that time, when I was working with my thesis, I started following the real guru at the time that was just starting to take off, and that was John Halazzi at Washington University in St. Louis. So during my last year at Iowa, I applied for his program, and not only was I accepted there, but Ron Turyoung, a good friend of mine at Iowa, was accepted, and so we migrated together to
Wow.
St. Louis, and we lived in the same apartment complex, and we would ride share with each other, and then Ron stayed with John Halazzi for 2 years, and I stayed for 3.
Okay.
And I thought at the time that I would be going back east, and I applied for a job at the University of Massachusetts in Worcester at the new medical school there, and there was a job freeze. And so they froze all hiring, and so I'm sitting there in sort of limbo, and Jim Barnard was at UCLA, and he was giving lectures at UC Irvine in the medical school there, and they were interested in hiring an exercise physiologist into the
Wow.
medical school
That's
program. So
that's
they had
impressive.
a forward thinking in the
Absolutely.
in that medical school, and Jim said, "No, I'm comfortable at UCLA." He says, "But I know a guy at WashU that might be the right fit for your program." And so the chair, Peter Hall, who was the chair of physiology, called me and invited me out.
Wow.
And I think I passed the audition, and he said, "In 3 weeks, I'm going to call you about 9 o'clock your time, and I'll tell you whether or not you have the job."
Oh, gee.
3 weeks to the minute, he called me. He says, "You have the job, and I want an answer in 4 days."
Wow. What year was that, Ken?
That was in 1973.
Okay, now this is the physiology department in the medical school at Irvine.
That's correct.
Okay.
And so
What a
I was
phone
fortunate
call.
enough to get the job. And as they say, the rest is history. I've been there for 37 years now.
Wow. Wow.
And one of the neat things about being in that medical school setting is that you have a lot of flexibility to
Absolutely.
run your research program. I did not have to get that much involved with undergraduate teaching because I was in a professional school, and it allowed me to spend full time with my research.
Was there much of a lab when you got there, or did you have to really set up a lab, or what was that situation like?
There wasn't anything there.
Really?
I had to start de novo.
Wow.
And the first thing I bought was a treadmill to run rats, because I was fortunate to have had a lot of freedom in the research that was ongoing at WashU. And in fact, when I went to WashU under John Halazzi, he wasn't focusing on the different types of fibers, the muscle types, the fast red, the fast white, the slow. And I learned through Jim Barnard that this was an up-and-coming area. I had experience with it for my Ph.D. dissertation, and then now I asked John if I could start to move on some of these things, and so I ended up publishing 16 papers in 3 years due to the experience that I had at Washington University with Dr. Halazzi, and I think I was the postdoc number 4, and he has gone on to train 96 individuals.
I'm going to talk to him later today, and same with Ron Turyoung. I'm going to talk to him. So it's been an exciting day, really.
Well, you know, we had a neat family under Tipton at Iowa, and there are several individuals that started with Tipton, ended up passing through John Halazzi, Frank Booth, Ron Turyoung, Jim Barnard, and a large number of other individuals that have gone on to be having an impact in the in exercise science and
I had no idea.
the
it was
ACSM.
90-some. I had no idea it was that many. That's amazing.
In fact, the first meeting I ever attended was in 1968. Was my first ACSM meeting in Atlanta, Georgia. And
Did Tipton get you involved in it?
That's how, I had a project that I worked with initially with Jim Barnard, and I made enough of a contribution that I ended up giving the presentation there, and it was an interesting experience.
Yeah. Tipton was saying that at that time there were very few, if any, students, members, and I guess that maybe you and Booth and Barnard were some of the first graduate student members in the college.
Probably so.
At that time.
Yeah.
Was that first meeting all in one room?
Just about. I think there were probably about 80 people there. You could fit it in a room, and it was It was a great experience.
I bet it was. So the MSSE was going then. ACSM had some of the publications, but where were you publishing? You were mainly publishing in physiology journals. At once you were with John, I should say. Those 16 papers.
Yes, almost all of those were in the American Physiological Society journals, the American Journal of Physiology, the Journal of Applied Physiology. There were a few other ancillary journals, but most of my publications have gone through the classical physiological journals.
Yeah.
And I have done some research in papers for MSSE as well. One of the, I'll get to that in a little bit.
Okay, so you get out to Irvine, you get your treadmill, you're getting started. When did you start getting your own graduate students then?
I started about the mid-1970s. I got my first graduate student, and then it was a steady stream after that. I have trained about 15 students. I have had a philosophy that I felt that it's important to put your energy with students, and if you have a big factory of them, you don't have that time to give them the one-on-one experience. And so I had a rule that I would never have more than 2 or 3 at most. And that has been the way that I have run my program.
When you started, Ken, you were running the rats, you said, and what were some of how has your lab changed, and what, over time, the kinds of things you were looking at?
Well, there was an opportunity that I had learned a lot through the experiences with the Halazi laboratory. And we were spending a lot of time trying to understand how endurance exercise impacted the plasticity of skeletal muscle. My area of focus throughout my whole career has been under the theme of muscle plasticity, how the different fibers adapt, how the cardiac muscle adapts to physical activity. And in 1978, NASA put a research announcement for applications for research for spaceflight. And I wrote a grant, and my hypothesis at the time was that going into space would be the antithesis to training for a marathon, in that you are in an unloaded state, the muscles are not exerting force, there's an atrophy process that's taking place, and my hypothesis was that there would be a deconditioning to the normal individual in space. And so I submitted a grant, it was approved, and then I started to do some ground models. And one of the models that came about was a paradigm that we refer to as hind limb suspension, where we apply traction to the tail of a rodent, and then we lift the hind limbs off the ground, and we had a swivel system so that the animals, when they locomoted, they used their forelimbs while their hind limbs were not able to, they actually get into a posture that we now know exactly mimics what the rats do when they're in space. And so at that time, there wasn't any real good data on what happens to animals in space, and so we started to do ground-based simulations, if you will. And so I started, that was a frame shift for me, because I had always been running animals on treadmills, and now I'm using this model, and the model was very unique in that within a week, you almost lost a third of the muscle mass.
Wow.
Which turns out that when they had the spaceflight disaster, it put the program out for almost 5 years. And so we didn't have our first space flight until 1991. So I was about 11 years sitting there
Wow.
spinning wheels,
Waiting to get
my project in space. And so once that happened, I ended up with 4 spaceflight experiments.
Wow.
And the upshot from those experiments was that the ground model, the hind limb suspension model, basically exquisitely mimics
Isn't
what
that
you
something?
see when the animals
Wow.
are in space.
Wow.
So it became a very good model.
Yeah.
And so I've combined that model almost for the rest of my career, and I focused on muscle plasticity and how to create countermeasures to alleviate the atrophy process. A lot of the things that we see happening to animals and humans in space, it's almost like a rapid aging, because it's
I wonder,
a
yeah.
type of sarcopenia where you're getting indeed a pure muscle atrophy that has some inactivity to the equation.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So when you suspended them in your model, they never came down. That was a constant suspension.
It was a constant suspension, 24/7, and
Yeah.
we ended up looking at the time course of this, and we had animals that we would suspend for out to 56 days.
So in a way, it's sort of like bed rest, or
It is the
inactivity.
equivalent. It's an inactivity model,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah.
But the key thing about what happens to the skeletal muscle of the animal, they're not exerting ground reaction forces in opposing gravity. For humans, that is a good paradigm for space flight for humans, and they will have individuals in bed rest, and you will get an atrophy response, just like you will in space flight.
Yeah.
And so there are some very good ground-based models that simulate space flight. It's not the ideal environment, but you can get a lot of insight through the bed rest studies in humans, as well as what we use for the hind limb suspension model for animals.
Were they concerned with the humans in that situation? If this is what's happening to the rats, what do we do to offset this with the astronauts?
Well, I think there is indeed an important comparison, because what we know about human skeletal muscle and rodent muscle has a lot of similarities to it. And when you take unloading away from the human, you transfer or transform the fibers from being capable of performing anti-gravity function, balance, and control. And the fibers switches their properties, their phenotype switches in many of the motor units from a slow phenotype to a fast phenotype. We saw that in our animal models, and then when they started allowing biopsies to be taken in the middle 1980s, they found out that the same thing that we had been documenting with animals indeed was the case for what we see with humans.
And that's actually a pretty fast process, isn't it? I mean,
It is.
People don't realize how fast atrophy can occur, and you
Yes.
probably determined that pretty clearly with those.
But you know,
models.
one of the most exciting findings that we had over the history of how the exercise science field has moved forward, we're into the cell and molecular. And now we have tools where we can find out what's happening to the transcription of genes. And the genes that I study are the motor proteins, the myosin motor protein gene family. And what we've just published, our most recent paper, we know that the atrophy process is starting within 6 hours.
Wow.
And by 2 days, we have a definitive measurement of muscle atrophy going on in the rodent muscle. We
That's
thought it took a
fantastic.
lot longer,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's almost like the switch happens
Wow.
as soon as you unload.
Isn't that something?
And,
So keep active.
So see, here's the importance of that observation is that when a lot of the astronauts go up in space, they don't do anything for a while.
Mhm.
But in my view, they should be starting
Yeah.
with their countermeasures
Right
the
away.
minute they
Soon.
get into the
Absolutely.
into that
Yeah,
unloading environment.
yeah.
So that's how I basically worked in this whole area of muscle
That's
plasticity.
fantastic. I could ask you questions for 2 hours.
Well,
It's so exciting.
I understand that, but
Good
now,
stuff. Well-
connections to ACSM, right?
Yeah, we only have 5 minutes left. So we talked about your meeting in '68, I think, when
Yeah.
when you went and gave your paper, and I assume you've been associated ever since.
Yes, I have only missed since that first meeting, I think, 3 meetings
Wow.
since, and they were due to deaths in the family.
Yeah.
Other than that, I've always been here, and
And what were you on the board of trustees and?
I was on the
different
board of
things?
trustees. I was one of the vice presidents. I spent a fair amount of time chairing the research committee. It was a new committee formed by the ACSM, and I was the first chair of that.
Mhm. In that time, what have you? I mean, ACSM, one thing, has gotten really big, and gotten into a lot of different things. How do you see things going today versus what you think they should be going?
Well,
Those types of things.
you've hit a key note there, and it's so diverse that the ACSM is predicated on science, and I think a lot of the science now is getting diluted a little bit.
Mhm.
We have, we want to be having such a broad umbrella, and I think we need to rejuvenate the basic science component to the ACSM. At one time, it was the meeting to go to if you wanted to really get first-rate science, because everyone was presenting their best stuff at ACSM.
Yeah.
That's no longer the case. There are specialty conferences that people are holding. You can only go to so many meetings, and some people are preferring to go there. The experimental biology meetings have matured. We have a section within the American Physiological Society where we have environmental and exercise section in there, and that is one of the second largest, only to cardiovascular, in that organization. So I think we need to do a little bit of rejuvenating there.
Ken, would it be fair to say, and I know what you're saying, but would it be fair to say that really ACSM was responsible for the upsurge in interest and taking exercise physiology especially very seriously, and actually through the ACSM model and the research that was going on here actually helped to impact these other groups
I think
to
that-
grow and to have a section?
Exactly.
I bet it's the very people that were at ACSM that helped start that section.
You're
in
exactly
the-
right.
Okay.
You're exactly right, Jack.
Okay.
In fact, if you look at the key members of the EEP section in the APS Society, they are the card members here as well.
That's what I would have guessed.
And so it's very difficult for individuals that we started our career through the ACSM framework. And then some of us are being diluted now, and there are other opportunities.
Yeah.
But I think that we have the capability. And what I think needs to be done within the ACSM is that we have to put more energy into the specialty interest groups, like the cell and molecular group that I'm a part of. In fact, Frank Booth, Toby Tate, and I were the originators of getting a section at that time going, and then all these other interest groups spun off, whether it was cardiovascular or what the other sections. And I think we need to put more energy into those. I think ACSM has to put resources to make those sections, the specialty
And to
sections,
keep them strong.
keep them strong,
Yeah.
and that will build the infrastructure back to its high point where it was for many, many, many years.
Yeah, I don't think there's any debate among anyone that you know, everyone understands that it was really the science base that put ACSM where there are, because without the science, you can't be making policy statements.
Well, that's the foundation.
Yeah, and as we proceed, that's going to have to remain strong.
I think so.
In order to keep having an impact. So,
Well, you know from your own research and history, science basically was the driver for the knowledge base and so forth.
Yeah,
The best minds in the world, as you studied them,
yeah,
they had it right way back when.
yes, they did.
And you
Yeah.
demonstrated that very nicely in your presentation the other day.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, it was excellent.
Well, anyhow, Ken, I told you, half hour goes really fast.
Well,
So, thanks a million for coming.
well, it was a pleasure to
and talking.
chat with you, Jack. I think you're doing a great service to the to ACSM, and keep up the great work.
Thank you. And if I wasn't as old as I am, I would try to become a graduate student in your program.
Well,
it's exciting stuff. That's
yeah.
really very, very exciting.
Just keep up the good fly fishing.
Yeah, I'm working on that too.
Good.
All right, thanks
Nice.
a lot.
Thanks again.
Appreciate it.